I'd like to discuss a little bit the render settings for Amorphium. Now, I'm going to discuss mostly the raster render or bitmap render settings. I will talk a little bit more about the Flash SWF render settings a little bit later on in the CD. Now, of course, to render, the very first thing you do is you select the Radio City button, or Radiosity. They like to call it Radio City. Not sure why, but kind of a joke, I guess. Anyway, selecting the camera button here, and then clicking anywhere in the window that you want to render with. Now, it could be any angle. If I was a front view, I could render from a front view. But I'm going to go ahead and click in this view here. And so now, first thing that comes up is your render window. Now, if I want, I can choose from here what camera I'm going to render with. I can also choose my resolution size, and for this I'm going to just go ahead and go 400 by 300. And you have also determination whether it's still image, animation, flash still, and flash animation, which I'll go into a little bit later, and also depth scans, which I mentioned earlier on in the CD. Mostly I'm going to just talk about still image and animation here. So I'm going to leave it at still image for this particular scene because it's just a still of these pool balls. So you also have shadows on and off. This turns on and off shadows for the whole scene. And you also have radiosity. Now, radiosity will add a lot to your render time. Like when you turn on radiosity, what it's going to do is that each object in its properties has a setting for radiosity. And this value for radiosity and color represents the object, the way light emits off the object. So like if you wanted an object to actually be a light source, you could actually turn up the value here and adjust the color that you want, and it could emit light within the scene, like as if light's bouncing off of it onto other objects. Now, I'm not going to show this too much because it's really tricky, and it takes a lot of time to play with to get the right settings. You can play with it if you like, and your render times really increase. I found for most uses you don't need it, and really you end up having to do a lot of test renders to get the look that you want, and taking a long time to render radiosity because it's having to calculate where light bounces off of objects. So that's where you would turn that on and off, is there. Now, as far as your other tabs up here, this is just the render tab. You also have anti-alias. Now this represents how smooth the edges are going to be when it renders. Depending on the amount of anti-aliasing you have here, it's going to take longer to do, but it's going to have a smoother edge. And then the oversample is how many times it's going to oversample on that anti-aliasing. It's going to increase the amount of smoothness to your anti-aliasing at this particular level. So I found that 4x4 is best. I hardly ever have to change this, and I usually set this to 4x4, and you get really good results, I find, with your renders. And you have adaptive and oversample, and these are two different types of methods of doing a render. I like oversample. It tends to have a little softer look. It just depends on the look that you want. And post blurring will blur it a little bit at the end to even smooth things a little bit more. Now, the animation tab is based on what your timeline is down here. So here is my end point to my animation, which is at about the 10-second mark, which is right here. It says it right here. If I change it here, it's going to change in my timeline. So I can set what the start and end frame are. If I'm only rendering one still frame, I can actually choose a current frame. If I know I want to render the frame that's on second 5, I could type it there. And then forth and back, what this will do is if I check that, if I have an animation that I want to loop and I haven't made a looping animation out of it, I can choose forth and back, and it will render all the way to the end of your keyframes, and then it will render all the way back. So it'll reverse it and go all the way back, so you have like a ping pong animation effect. And then you can also select what your frames per second are, because right now it's 10 seconds, and it's going to render 10 frames a second, so every second is going to have 10 frames. If my keyframes were every second, then between those keyframes there would be 10 frames. If I wanted 30 frames, it would render 30 frames between keyframes. And then the number of frames is just the total number of frames. Since 10 frames per second and 10 seconds is going to be 100 frames. So if I change this, it's going to change the values. So now the QuickTime tab is only going to be used if you have it selected to animation. If you have animation selected, and of course the animation tab will only work as far as your time settings and frames per second will only work if you have animation selected, but QuickTime will only work if you have that selected as well. And then you have all these different file formats for QuickTime. Now what this is whatever QuickTime formats are installed, like if, as you can see, because we have some DV codecs installed here for this Macintosh, that it includes those as well, because anything that QuickTime has, it's going to have. And you're able to adjust the quality setting for those. And so any format that QuickTime can render, it will show up in there. And then there's the Flash tab, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the Flash section. And then there's World Properties, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. But for now, this is the base render settings that you would set up for rendering a still or an animation. So I'm going to go ahead and select, make sure it's at 400 by 300, shadow selected, and I'm going to do a still image and then hit render. So now that it's rendered, you can see that I had some reflections on these objects. You can see it's reflecting this, the 2 ball here is reflecting the 11 ball a little bit here, and the 8 ball and the table just a little. Now keep in mind too that I have 3 lights in this scene, and semi-soft shadows in here, plus reflections like this. The more of the features you add, like soft shadows, reflections, and lights, the longer your render times will be. So keep that in mind as you start to build. You'll start to see that your scenes will start taking longer and longer and longer to animate and to render because of the time involved in calculating all these features. So just keep that in mind as you build your scenes. If you want faster render times, you'll have to limit some of those features that you use. So now once you've rendered a still image like this is only with still images. With animations, Flash stills, Flash animations, it always asks you to save the file first. Whereas an image, a still image, will render first, display the image, and then ask you to save it by this little button here. If I just close this, I'll lose my render. So what I want to do is click on Save Image, and then give it a name and choose the format that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and choose JPEG Lossless, and I'm going to call this Pool Table. And I'm going to click Save. So now I've saved that image. So if I hadn't have saved the image and I closed this, it would have asked me if I wanted to save it. It'd bring up a little pop-up saying, do you want to save? Are you sure you want to close? So anyway, the difference with rendering an animation is as soon as I select animation and click render, it's going to ask me to save that right away. And since GIF was the format that was selected, it's going to have that as the format. But I don't want to do an animation with this particular file. So that's basically the way the render settings work within Amorphium, and how you would select your different render settings for the different types of renders that you want to achieve in your output settings.